Questions, please. Thank you.
Jackie Kelly from Lutheran Community Care. One of the dilemmas that we're grappling with in the change from the old economy to the new economy is, on the one hand, we've got a changing nature of work and term of work and casualisation of the workforce and people having a lot of different times with different institutions. And the other issue of one of the common characteristics of sustainable high-performing organisations over the long term is the longevity of key personnel and continuity of the leadership team. And I'm just wondering if the panel has any comments on how we might think about that and plan for that and organise ourselves for that going forward in the future.
Well, let me give you my experiences in that area. We have on the corporate boards, some of the corporate boards I sit on, large workforces where the nature of work is being altered quite sharply. Not just the introduction of technology and software, etc., but also in the way in which projects are managed, such as using lean methodologies or agile methodologies, which rely upon the formation of teams, small teams, meeting every day, managing a project through to completion, usually a software development project, and often connected to work in other laboratories around the world. So you've got real-time broadband connectivity. You walk onto a floor, you see screens, you know that that's Chengdu and that's Manila, etc., etc. And so how do you get workers to make the transition work productively? Firstly, communication is very important. Employee engagement is very, very important. Many of these changes in roles also leads to reduction in local workforces as work is shared globally, and that has a potential demoralising effect. Remarkably, when people understand the purpose of the changes and see the improvements, they seem to be keen to be part of the transitional arrangements. You certainly have to have HR practices that are just and fair, if not generous. So they are all features of a modern workplace. There is a vulnerability felt amongst older workers for whom dealing with all of the kind of online processes doesn't come automatically, and you've got people coming out of universities who are supremely literate, who actually enter universities with levels of dexterity and familiarity with devices and software far beyond what universities can offer them. Then they build on that. They come to work. They are very, very expert in these areas, and therefore they are seen to be quite different to what you see as the normal workforce. So this characterises a sort of somewhat tumultuous, at least superficially, environment in a modern workforce. Having said that, we've got executives and managers who manage that. Employees have worked through that situation now for at least 20 years, which is since email first arrived, Stephen. And people have learned how to do that, and it seems to succeed. Can I describe a formula? Probably not.
Can I just make one comment? One of the challenges, I think, for particularly people in your business, the continuity and the knowledge issue. How do you manage a workplace where knowing about the individuals you're dealing with, knowing about the history is so important, and yet your workforce churns over? And I think all of us face that. I was very fortunate in my last job, and indeed I'm very fortunate in this job. I have a lot of people who are incredibly skilled and very committed and have been there for a long time, and that is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But increasingly, people will do the 18-month in and out. So knowledge management, how it is we retain the key bits of history so people can find it, I think is actually one of the biggest challenges, because you cannot download from every individual as they walk out the door everything that's in their head. And I find myself sounding like grandma when I go, oh, well. Now, and I actually said this very recently in the cabinet room here, I said, well, what happened in 96, 97 about that was, and I looked around and thought, I'm one of the only people who was actually there. Scary. But it required me to have it in my head. So working through how we knowledge manage, and I don't think anyone's got that right yet. I think that's actually one of the big challenges for us.
stand up and sing.
I've got a question for Jane. Adrian here from AECOM. I'm based in Canberra. I suppose I'm a keen watcher of the bureaucracy, and you've pretty much given us a manifesto of the public service in Canberra, I thought. You talked about flexible funding arrangements. I wasn't sure if you were meaning funding the things that we do, as an example, infrastructure, or funding the services that government provides. Could you expand on your flexible funding commentary?
So I think that's the challenge for us, is to actually look at both of those things. The reality is we have, experiment is the wrong word, we have innovated in a number of ways in the funding of both physical and social infrastructure in the last however many years. Those of us, now I do sound like grandma, those of us who remember when we had the CES, Job Network, various iterations of that. We now fund for outcomes in some domains. We fund with particular attributes. Similarly, the old days where government just stumped up a lick of capital in respect of large infrastructure projects, that is not necessarily the way you would proceed anymore. And the truth of the matter is, there is, I think, a perfectly reasonable expectation amongst the community that government will not be a huge drag on the economy. That means we need to think about how we deploy resources and how we get the best outcome. So be it a dam, be it getting an employment outcome for a young Aboriginal person who lives on a remote community, looking innovatively about how we do that, I think is part of our challenge. And certainly my view is policy advice and innovation. If the public service is not doing that, we are not doing our jobs.
Andrew, thank you.
Thank you. Andrew Stevens. I'm the chair of the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre for Minister McFarlane. It seems that we've talked today about the impact of the connected world, making everything global, changing demand patterns, particularly the emerging world, and the impact that's had, and also changing demographics. But there's one other very significant change that's happening, and that's the communications nature of this technological revolution, which, as Ziggy said, you forgot the steam engine, Ziggy, and the role of shipping and railways, but we've been through many, many technological innovations in the past, and they've all required flexibility, as Jane's talked. But the connected world this time means that this generation is in a unique position compared to all others since the cotton gin invention. And that is that all of those previous generations, you had to move the people to the work, and today you move the work to the people using communications technology and broadband. So it does seem that this has the potential to unravel or seriously advantage countries who ignore their international boundaries but play a global game in jobs and skills. So we could be seriously hollowed out in terms of our service jobs by other countries moving more swiftly into the capability we have, or we could seriously, because of the market disequilibrium that we're in, move very, very strongly in this area. And I know right now, we're just confirming the numbers, but Australia is now $15 an hour more competitive than any country in the world, in the Asian time zone, on knowledge-infused service roles. $15 an hour. We are less competitive in the production labour, but that's not too bad because it's only 3% of direct inputs. But in things that could seriously advantage us, we are now highly competitive. And as the US dollar improves, we will improve in that competitiveness. So the point, I think, is it's a different situation. I don't think we want to end up as the world's gardeners and haircutters. In other words, those physical things that can't work, because we will not sustain our average income of $53,000 a year doing that. What we need to do is have a strategy for jobs which is different to industries and companies, that says there are certain types of things that Australia happens to have a competitive advantage in. Certain roles, certain things. And personally, I don't think that if we had more STEMs, we'll have an assured future. STEM skills, we'll have an assured future, is quite good enough. The people I've spoken to in our numerous consultations would say that STEM skills are necessary but not sufficient in what we do. But those interactive, knowledge-infused jobs with a very high lot of data analytics empowered says that is the golden land for Australia as we see it right now. comments.
Mark, thank you.
Thanks. Just an initial comment, Andrew. So I kind of accept the premise that in some instances it is more efficient to move the work to the people, and we see that with those ability to offshore jobs to India. There was that terrific example of the bloke in Silicon Valley last year who outsourced his entire job to somebody in India, and still made money. I think the other point, though, if we're talking about knowledge-infused jobs, is there is the idea of agglomeration economies, which is that combining very, very smart people together, bouncing ideas off one another, which is kind of the idea of Silicon Valley, has been one of the things that drives growth. So I think it's certainly true that we might see some jobs offshored, but I can't see that happening in any kind of big way.
Well, the question is, what are the jobs that are going to be onshored because of our agglomeration? Yep. What's the policy? What's the role of government? What's the role of industry? That's really the question.
Firstly, I think it's a terrific comment, Andrew. I think we should be just a bit careful about assuming that all service jobs are sort of low value added. Many are. We talk about gardeners and hairdressers and security personnel, etc. But I think I heard this morning, Stephen, one of the speakers say that increasingly our service products are becoming trade exposed and competing internationally. I know education certainly is in that. So the future must involve, as we move more and more into a service-based economy, making more and more of our service products globally relevant and competitive, and exposing us to what constitutes best practice internationally, and learning. So, I mean, I too find very seductive reference to robotics and advanced manufacturing. Whether we're going to end up having a very large labour force as a result of that, I don't think so. I think we might have considerable contribution to the economy, but it won't be through those jobs. But in service it might be. So we've got to find in the provision of our professional services, legal services, accounting services, etc., a greater role in the region initially and perhaps globally. With that will come jobs. With them will come a better kind of trade balance situation.
Jane, final comment?
I guess I'd just make one comment. We heard in the remarks before mine about how... No, both of you actually. That actually we have a huge opportunity if we go towards things that cannot be automated, put it that simply. And so STEM, I think, is an opportunity, but STEM without EQ, STEM without an analytical capability and an understanding of what the consequence of whatever you're advising, doing, etc. on, is not actually much use to us, because that actually is largely mechanical. You think about data analytics. You can now buy the most powerful analytical tools and feed just about any data set into it, ask a question and get an answer. Do you actually need people who have all of those personal skills? Probably not. It's the question you ask and knowing what to do with the answer, which is actually the value part of the equation. And I think that for us is the challenge, is to say we need people who get STEM, but we actually need to think about what it is people will want to know, what service do they want to receive, which actually is about that value add. And that's where I think we've got the opportunity. And that for us in terms of the policy side, how do we educate our kids? What is it that they're actually going to be doing at school that not only gives them that base level of capability, but also means that they have the interpersonal skills, the communication skills, the thinking skills to actually be able to make a contribution. It's what I look for in incoming junior public servants. I assume a level of technical capability, it's the stuff on top. And I think that's where our economy needs to be.
Can I just build on one relevant, especially relevant comment of Jane's, and that's on the importance or lack of in terms of coding capability. I think that's a topic that's arrived in the last month, and it's a very useful subject around which to have a national conversation. But what that means to me is that at a very early age, in elementary school and high school, kids have to be exposed to the logic associated with making programming decisions. And they are being exposed through games, through parts of the curriculum. That is not the same thing as saying we need to have lots of coders. There are 11 million people coding around the world at the moment, and we are outsourcing most of our programming work to them. It probably isn't going to be an area for careers for a lot of people.
I have time for one final question. Thank you, Mick.
Meg McDonald from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and it's a question for all three of you, because we've talked about education as a base, but what I heard through the presentations, in particular from Jane, is this idea that you're in a process of learning throughout career and the difficulty of knowledge capture for if you've got a very fluid workforce. But I haven't heard anything about what and how we can adapt the education system to be more adroit at actually being able to capture this and diffuse it through the workforce in ways which reflect this fluidity, because traditional education is just going to provide a base. How do we provide that career-long learning, which is beyond just the workplace learning?
We're all looking at each other here. You know what? I don't know that we know the answer to that question. I mean, I think I made that comment about looking more broadly. We need to not be self-referencing on this. We need to look at what's going on in the Scandinavian countries. We need to look at what's going on elsewhere in the world, and we need to continually challenge ourselves and, can I say, use the research evidence to back ourselves up. We need to think about where we invest, but we need to invest in a way that is rational and is evidence-driven. So I can't answer that question. I mean, I think we can specify what we want. I think we have an idea about the kind of attributes that we're looking for, and then we need to look both domestically but internationally as well to say, what can we beg, steal, borrow or innovate here ourselves, and based on the evidence, what is it we should be doing? But other than that, I can't answer that question yet.
Look, students are coming to university to learn a particular skill, eventually to get a job, but they don't actually expect to do that job for very long. And employers are asking universities to provide job-ready students, but with particular skills of teamwork, managing complexity, communications, that provide the raw materials that the employer can then transmute into what they think is valuable for their enterprise. And universities are trying to do that. At the same time, they're dealing with their own technical challenges as we move. The metaphor is, if you've got driverless cars, you might have teacherless universities, because everything will be done online and students will come on campus infrequently to attend tutorials. So I find actually the university environment is a hotbed of debate, trial. I'm not yet sure of great innovative steps, but that will follow. And again, I remind you, we tend to think traditionally, our mental model is develop a student, give them skills and set them on the way to a career. But an employer wants a student for a particular task, and increasingly that person will then move on. That person will be in the care of that employer, or that employer will rent that person for 3, 4 or 5 years and not expect much more than that going forward. So, but we're in that transition period at this stage.
Chancellor, I suggest you come to the University of Wollongong and have a look. They'll show you how that's done. Mark, final comment.
Look, I just want to probably add to what Ziggy said, and I think the scope for people to direct their own learning into source material that they can learn themselves is infinitely greater now than what it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. I don't know whether it's going to go through MOOCs or just through the resources people are able to identify themselves, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there for people to embrace the future and have that kind of self-directed learning. I also think that employers are really quite savvy around who they hire to do work, and the whole notion of formal accreditation through qualifications and so on is a bit 20th century, and employers will work out who are the right people who've got the right skill sets in ways that I think we should be confident about.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like on your behalf to thank our 3 presenters for this final session this afternoon.